Hey guys, what's going on? It's BJ here to wish everybody a happy Cinco de Mayo um, holiday. Cinco de Mayo, of course, is the 5th of May, celebrating the Mexican victory over the French Empire in 1862. Now, basically, what happened was that Mexico had a civil war between its Reform Party. It's called the Reform Civil War of 1861 between its Reform Party, which is its Liberal Party, which kind of represented, liberal social mores and a political move away from the control of the Catholic Church that it had been under when it was under Spanish colonization. And its Conservative Party, which basically wanted the exact opposite, basically just like the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s. This happened in a lot of um, Latin American countries. And because of their need to pay for this war, they defaulted on their loans. The president of Mexico at that time, Benito Juarez, he basically told France, Britain, and Spain, listen, we're not going to pay you the debts that we owe you. We're going to just owe those debts and we're going to default on those loans. Well, of course, that had France, Britain, and Spain all upset. Um, Britain and Spain came to an agreement with Mexico at the time. France, however, which was under Napoleon III, did not. And then France invaded Mexico in a desire to take over Mexico and reconquer the Americas. Because remember, the United States had issued the Monroe Doctrine decades earlier, telling all the European countries, especially France and Spain, that they needed to step out of America's territory in the Western Hemisphere. But the United States at this time during the 1860s was preoccupied with fighting its own civil war. The war between the states, the Confederacy versus the Union. So, being as though the United States was distracted, France thought this was the perfect opportunity. And being as though they felt like they had a justification for invading Mexico, they felt like it was the perfect opportunity to invade Mexico. So in 1862, the Mexican army in the Battle of Puebla defeated the French army and repelled them back to Europe. It didn't really last because a year later, France uh, would take Mexico ultimately and install the French government in Mexico. But by then, the United States was out of the was out of the Civil War, and basically, intervened, and Mexico was once again free. So this is a holiday celebrated by the Mexican American community and by Mexicans in Mexico because that president Benito Juarez, who was the leader at that time, who led the troops in the battle for the Battle of Puebla, made it an official holiday in Mexico. But it's very important here with Mexican Americans in the United States, partially because uh, the involvement in the Civil War. The win in the Battle of Puebla prevented a Confederate victory. If the Confederates had, if the French had established a port here in the Americas, it was quite possible they were at that time a Confederate ally, as was England. England was also considering recognizing the independence of the Confederacy. So if that had happened, hypothetically, alternate history, maybe the Union would have not won the Civil War. That is quite a possibility. So, what do people in Mexico and the Mexican American, the Chicano American community do for this celebration? They hear a lot of Mexican music, a lot of banda, a lot of ranchera, a lot of Tejano music, a lot of conjunto music, a lot of traditional Mexican music and Mexican dances. And it's sort of a second Independence Day. Many people think, many people in the United States are under the impression that this is Mexico's Independence Day. It is not. Mexico's Independence Day is September 16th. Um, celebrating the Cry of Dolores in 1810. Uh, that is Mexico's independence against Spain. So there are two different holidays. But this is Mexico's defeat and repudiation of the French army in 1862. And people always get that confused because they're like, what the hell? The French in Mexico, people tend to think, oh, well, Mexico, of course, they were colonized by the Spanish because they're a Spanish speaking country, yes, but at this time, they were already independent. They had achieved their independence by the 1820s. And of course, with the United States in the 1830s and 40s, they suffered tremendous losses with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, um, and the loss of all of the southwestern states, northern Mexico. So they had a tumultuous history, and even after this, they would continue to have a tumultuous history because in the 1910s, they had another Mexican revolution in which they overthrew the government. And right now, um, Mexico is basically controlled by a lot of narco drug cartels, coming out of certain cities like Juarez, which is named for Benito Juarez, and uh, other Mexican states. But despite that, we have a huge Mexican American population here in the United States, and it's a big important holiday. Here in New York City, it's not so much of a big important holiday because um, up until very recently, there wasn't a lot of Mexican people, either Mexican nationals or Mexican Americans. So people here in New York, the Hispanic community in New York, which is mostly Caribbean descent, really didn't know anything about it. I remember when I uh, was going to school in Spanish class, every year we would get off, uh, from our our other types of regular classes to celebrate um, Mexican heritage and Latino American heritage, um, the whole entire day with Spanish music, Spanish food, in the gym, picnics with uh, all our friends and everything. It was pretty awesome, pretty cool. It was a pretty laid back, chill day. And you'd be like, well, hardly any of the kids are Mexican American. Why are we celebrating this? But of course, Mexico is the biggest uh, cultural influencer of Spanish America and Latin America. And actually, this is when the term Latin America actually came into vogue, when people started to use the term Latin America because, of course, with the French trying to establish territories here, they wanted to connect themselves in a way um, to the Americas, because they were trying to colonize it. So they came up with this theory. Oh well, we're Latins. Our language, French, is descended from Latin, and the Iberian America is also descended from Latin, with their cultural language being Spanish and Portuguese. So we share a common heritage rooted in the language of Rome and the heritage of ancient Rome. So that's when they came up with this term, Latin America. And that basically became the word that we use for all of Spanish and Portuguese America. You know what I mean? So that makes sense that a lot of the kids would be uh, tied in, that even those that weren't Mexican or Mexican American, they would share in this heritage as well. I think a lot of people think it's Mexican Independence Day because our Independence Day is called July the 4th. So they think, oh, well, the Mexican Independence Day must be May the 5th. No, uh, this was more like this. If you wanted to draw a parallel between something in American history and something with this, it wouldn't be the 4th of July. It would be basically the Battle of Fort McHenry in the War of 1812. Because in the War of 1812, we didn't achieve our independence. We already had our independence. But what we did do is rebuff British recolonization. And, we reestablished ourselves. Like, when we established ourselves again, the United States was known at this time was something to be taken serious. That our victory over the Europeans wasn't a fluke. So this was exactly the same thing. We were showing the Mexicans were showing that their victory over the Spaniards, their achievement of independence wasn't a fluke. That they could achieve independence once again with a victory over a different European power. So that's really what I compare it to. So if people want to draw parallels between this and an American war, I say the War of 1812. And just like the War of 1812, they were invaded. Remember, we were invaded during the War of 1812. We were already a sovereign nation, and the British burned down the White House in order to get us to surrender or try to surrender, our sovereignty. So happy Cinco de Mayo to all my Mexican American and Mexican friends. And an interesting historical side note, you know what other famous world leader was named after Benito Juarez? Benito Mussolini. Benito Mussolini, who would become famous and infamous as the leader of Italy during World War II. His family was a socialist. His family was a socialist, and he was a socialist to start off with. So his family was very um, admired Benito Juarez very much and named him after it. So not only Benito Juarez, um, is famous in history as a Benito, but also Benito Mussolini, who was his namesake. So look at that. Not that not that Benito Mussolini is somebody to praise or somebody to honor. I'm just saying that kind of shows the bilateral influences between Southern Europe and the Americas, where oftentimes we think it's only a unilateral influence, like culture only goes one way. Well, Southern Europe influenced uh, Southern Europe influenced Latin America, but Latin America didn't influence Southern Europe. And that's not necessarily true. It was a bilateral influence between the two, even Italy. And also, what's interesting about Benito Juarez is that he was of indigenous descent. We know in Mexico that ever since the Spanish conquest, there's been this kind of, in all of Latin America, really, but especially Mexico, because Mexico already before the 1500s had an indigenous developed civilization. They had the Aztecs in the central part of Mexico and the Mayans, right, in the Central America and the Yucatan. So, uh, unlike, say, the Caribbean islands, whose indigenous population wasn't really developed, in Mexico it really was developed, and it was already a cosmopolitan civilization that the Spanish superimposed their civilization on. So there's always been that kind of struggle with the casta system between people that are of indigenous descent and people that are more of European or more heavier Europeanized mestizos in the country. So indigenous leaders and people of indigenous descent, that represent more indigenous features such as um, Benito Juarez or even Cesar Chavez, that was the leader of the Delano Freedom Marches in the 1960s in Northern California. They've been really marginalized even within the Mexican and Mexican American community, which as an expression of colorism and racism. So the fact that Benito Juarez was of indigenous descent is a source of pride for Mexican and Mexican Americans who are of more indigenous ancestry. So not only is it a prideful thing for um, uh, Mexicans as a whole, but it's a prideful thing for Mexicans of indigenous ancestry, kind of like analogous to Crispus Attucks and his role in the Boston Massacre when talking about African Americans here in the United States. So anyway, happy Cinco de Mayo. Um, Rest in peace to my teacher, my Spanish teacher, Miss Manelli. Every time Cinco de Mayo comes around, I think of her often. You know what I mean? And I think of how, enriched we were that she exposed us to this holiday that many of us, due to our geographical locations, would have never really been aware of. Um, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see when my next video is coming out. And if you're a boxing fan, um, Cinco de Mayo is also a pretty cool day because that's when a lot of the good fights come out. Because Mexican Americans and Mexicans in general are very big boxing enthusiasts, and they have a lot of the history of Mexican boxing goes way back to the beginning of boxing. Um, and they have some of the greatest fighters ever, especially in the lighter weight divisions. I know me as a Puerto Rican, there is a historic rivalry between those two countries when it comes to boxing. But on this day, this is their day, so you got to give it up to them. Uh, this is when you see fighters like, well, used to in the '90s, like Julio Cesar Chavez, and now you see Canelo, being paraded out there as the champion of all Mexican people. So yeah, it is what it is, guys. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see when my next video is coming out. Love y'all. Peace.